Hello, everyone. So, I thought I'd just make some time to return to the four Jungian dichotomies being explained correctly. So, in my previous video, I talked about extrovert versus introvert. Um, that is the first of the four Jungian dichotomies, the dichotomies most famously known and which are central to the Myers-Briggs type indicator. I'm now going to describe the second one, which is sensor versus intuitor, comprising the S versus the N. The reason they choose an N is that they already had the I used for introvert, so they take the second letter, the N, and make that the big letter, the capital letter. So S versus N, sensor versus intuitor, you could say, which is always a bit confusing, but yes. What do I have to say about sensor versus intuitor? So I don't think it is as misunderstood as extrovert versus introvert, or indeed judger versus perceiver, which I cover. I'll be going to quite a bit of a longer video for that one. But when it comes to sensor versus intuitor, I think it's relatively straightforward. I think it's not too difficult an idea to muck up, essentially. But nevertheless, rather than say that there are complete misunderstandings, it's more that there's a lack of clarity around what it means to be a sensor versus intuitor. Um, I think a source of that lack of clarity is the vague term a preference. And this is what's used in Myers-Briggs type indicator a lot. You have a preference for sensing over intuition. And the problem with the word preference is that it's ambiguous. It's ambiguous in what a preference is. For instance, they often use the example of handedness versus right-handedness. Now, that's a kind of preference. In other words, you're more confident using, say, your right hand than your left hand if you're right-handed. That's preference in terms of confidence. You lean on that one more because it is better at being used than the other. But there's another meaning of preference, and that's more to do with your values, essentially. If you prefer something because you like it more, for instance, um, in the north they tend to prefer a curry sauce on their fish and chips. In the south, they may prefer salt and vinegar. So that is a preference again, but it's not about confidence anymore. It's about values. It's about what you like more, what you appreciate more. So those are two very different understandings of the word preference. And unfortunately, the choice of preference has thereby obscured these two very important differences. And I say they are very important because they are. They are crucial to Jungian typology. The difference between being strong or more confident at something versus being valued, versus that thing being valued, versus that thing being something you actually like and appreciate. If you could very easily like something, could value something, but not be good at it. You could, at the same time, not value something, but be good at it, just not want to draw too much attention towards it. So those distinctions are very, very important for Jungian typology, especially when you start going into more advanced theories such as socionics. To obscure that with the word preference is asking for trouble. And I think it does cause trouble. I think that there is a conflation for, say, sensors and intuitors between being strong at sensing or intuiting and conflating that with preferring to sense versus intuit in terms of a value. And yeah, that also causes people who are sensors to be almost lumped together in terms of their values when actually they could have very different values. Some sensors may share some values with intuitors and vice versa, depending on what kinds of intuitors we're talking about. So what I would say is the key thing to keep in mind when explaining sensing versus intuiting correctly is to ensure you're only talking about strength. In other words, how confident and capable you are using that thing, not about values. It should have nothing to do with values. That's the very important thing to consider, which means, for instance, you get people saying, oh, sensors don't like deep conversations. That is absolute nonsense. It depends on the sensor, and it depends on what deep means. It depends on what that thing is, what kind of deep you have in mind when you say they don't like deep conversations. To say, for instance, that intuitors don't like things in the immediate day to day, again, is nonsense. It depends what it is. It depends. Their values will orientate themselves in favor of something in the present day and away from something else in the present day. So you can't. It's very important not to generalize by essentially not considering the differences in values between sensors and also between intuitors. It's important to always just consider it in terms of strength. Now, that's one thing. This idea that intuitors are going to share the same strengths in intuition and sensors are going to share the same strengths in sensation. Now, it's also worth keeping in mind that, as well as that similarity in strength, you can also have variation depending on the type in terms of the kind of other thing they are developing. So let me explain that a bit more. Let me unpack that a bit more. So let's say you have sensors versus intuitors. What can we say about sensors in general? We can say that sensors in general are good or confident at handling in the immediate moment present concrete things. They are more likely to be able to see details. They're more confident at working with real concrete things. They tend to be both more able to be tactical in the moment, not having to think too far ahead, just acting and knowing how to act. But they also tend to be more detail aware, more logistical, more able to arrange and manage the day-to-day stuff. That's purely what they're able to do. It isn't necessarily what they choose to do, which is hence the values conflation with strengths can get in the way. And meanwhile, intuitors, they are going to be more confident with the abstract, um, with ideas, with possibilities, with a sense of what could happen later down the line in terms of time, or what may have happened going back into the past, as long as it's not something which they've seen themselves. Intuitors will tend to have more of an advantage in terms of being able to imagine what that's likely to have been like. So really the main thing is sensors are most confident at perceptions that are right here, right now, and managing those perceptions. And intuitors are going to be most confident at managing anything which is not right here or right now, but rather could be far off in the future, or could be a completely alternative possibility to what we actually have in front of ourselves. So that's really the idea, that intuitors are more in their heads imagining things. And don't confuse that with introversion. That's the one thing. Intuition tends to twist things towards introversion, because suddenly by being in your head, you're being introverted. You're not being introverted. You're just detaching from the day-to-day environment around you. And by being sensing, it makes you more engaging with the physical real world. That doesn't make you more extroverted, although it tends to lead to more extroverted results in MBTI tests, which is a problem with a test, I would say. Yes, no, you're more active, you're more engaging, because you actually you are working with real concrete physical things. So that's what I say intuitors have in common, and what sensors in contrast have in common. So now what I would say, let me take this point about how sensors can grow into certain kinds of intuition and intuitors can grow into certain kinds of sensation. This is where you need to factor in extroversion versus introversion. So you could say quite falsely that sensors cannot be strategic. This is wrong. It depends on the sensor. Some sensors can be very far-sighted and strategic, because they would have developed their introverted intuition, because they're introverted. Those who are introverted and sensory should have the ability to access that kind of intuition. they should just struggle to access the other kind of intuition, the more breadth, out of the box ideas, lots of different possibilities kind of intuition. In contrast, the extroverted senses, those are the ones who should struggle with thinking strategically in the long term. They are going to, however, be more capable of growing into that breadth-oriented, many different ideas, brainstorming approach to intuition. And if you flip it around, right, it comes to intuitors, right? Intuitors, where they're extroverted, they're going to be more able to be more assertive and direct in the physical moment, in the immediate present physical moment, I should say. Whereas introverted and intuitive types, they're going to be more able to grasp day-to-day details and maintain those. And of course, the sacrifice is that the extroverted intuitive types are going to struggle most of the details, and the introverted intuitive types are going to struggle the most with in-the-moment assertiveness and direct action taking without having to think it all through. So yeah, those are some of the differences between intuitors and the differences between senses, which is why you can't really generalize across. As soon as you start to factor in growth, suddenly you end up with a difficult situation where intuitors can start testing as senses, and senses can start testing as intuitors, because they've actually grown into that part which you've said is going to be not preferred. Well, actually, that thing is very much preferred by them. It's just not naturally strong. They've grown into it. And now, if it's there, what we call the mobilizing function, or the tertiary function in Myers-Briggs speak, that is actually going to be pushed a lot, basically almost as much as your leading function, your dominant function. So you can't really say it's not preferred. It's just not naturally strong. Now, this takes me to another point I need to explain, which is, what does strength really mean? How can we make strength as precise as possible? Well, because you could say, if they're growing, then if they're growing, don't they become strong at it? So how is it still weak, even if you've grown into it and you developed it? Well, the definition of weak versus strong is this, or the distinction, I should say, is that a strong function, a strong function should be something which you can utilize in completely new situations. Meanwhile, a weak function you shouldn't be able to utilize in completely new situations. So when it comes to something you have no past familiarity with at all, right? If you are strong in that area, you should be able to quickly pick up what's going on and adapt and find the appropriate way of utilizing that kind of information in that kind of situation. In contrast, if you're weak at it, you won't be able to do that. You'd need to have tried and failed and maybe learnt and acquired certain rules and norms of how you usually do it. If you're plucked out of a familiar situation but into a new situation, that's when you're likely to fail in a weak function. However, if you are someone who has the luxury of being able to practice in that area, become familiar with that area, suddenly that weak function can start to look like a strong function because you're operating within a zone of familiarity. It's the key difference is when you take someone out of that familiarity. If it's weak, it should fail. If it's strong, it should remain strong. It should remain able to manage. And yeah, there are certain differences there if the function is also, if the element in that function is opposite to your vertness, you could say. If you're an extroverted type and you're using an introverted element that's also weak, you're going to be less able to build that sense of familiarity. Whereas if you are someone for whom the vertness matches, let's say you're an ENTP and you're engaging with extroverted sensing, right? The vertness matches extroversion, then you should be able to build that zone of familiarity over time. You've been around the block in that area. You understand how it's used in certain situations. You'll be able to use it rather well. You could even look like it's strong in certain situations. But if you're then using introverted sensing, that's where the vertness doesn't match. That's where you're going to find you don't quite find the confidence to actually build that zone of familiarity. So you're sort of consistently weak at it in that sense. So there's a lot of nuance here. That's why it is difficult to really. This is why I don't tend to just say, oh, that person's a sensor, that person's an intuitor. Instead, I'm thinking, okay, what kind of intuition am I seeing? What kind of sensation am I not seeing? As an example, if someone is very clearly, very deeply reflective, and they're not very physically active as a result, they're not very direct, they're not very action oriented. I skip the intuitive versus sensor. I go straight to this is introverted intuition as the main focus, and extroverted sensing is the deficit. That's how I find it far more useful to understand these types. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. I think some other things I should say. This isn't said by the official Myers-Briggs at all, but there's a sort of idea that sensors are stupid. It's not true. There is, I would say, a great deal of value that sensors bring. If the world were to end tomorrow, I said, well, if society were to crumble, the sensors would be the ones who survive, not the intuitors. Intuitors are only able to manage, I would say, and even be advantaged in a civilization where you're actually rewarded for thinking far ahead, where you can place trust in the long term because you've got a stable system with trust in finance, with all sorts of different parts coming together to allow you to be strategic. As soon as that goes, as soon as it becomes a situation of man plans, God laughs, the sensors are going to thrive. And yeah, instead, it's incredibly important to think, what do sensors do which intuitors can't do? Well, first of all, they are able to act very quickly and very decisively in a way that doesn't lead to a total mess. They don't tend to essentially mismanage their day-to-day affairs. They tend to be aware of what's going on around them. They are, I would say, perhaps far less likely to have car crashes. I had a car crash quite recently. So it's the sort of thing where sensors are far better at managing the day-to-day in immediate physical space around them. They're far better at that. They aren't naturally as strategic, but some can be very strategic, especially introverted ones when they develop their introverted intuition. But the point is, they have a far more practical intelligence, and that practical intelligence tends to actually come in handy a lot. Meanwhile, the intuitors, well, their advantages. Well, as I said, they are more imaginative. They are more able to think outside the box. They're more able to visualize something far further down the line than we are, where we're actually currently making decisions on what we need to be doing. So that certainly is a very good skill, very good strength to have in certain situations. In most situations, it's probably better to actually be the sensor. So yeah, it's not. There's this idea that the sensors are just sort of the more common types. They're the more stupid ones. They are the conforming ones. It's that's really not the idea of a point. Some of the most impactful people in the world have been sensors, especially the extroverted sensing ones, because they act, they jump forwards, and they actually get the prize before you've even been able to think about what you're going to do. So yeah, I'd say that sensors can be very powerful indeed, and very smart in a way which is more concrete and more immediately applicable. So yeah, that's what I'd say. And also this idea of intuitors being amazingly special and gifted people. Okay. Their insights, their ability to read where things are likely to go. Yeah, sure, that can be a great gift. But what's often missed out in Myers-Briggs is how incompetent intuitors can also be, how they can mismanage themselves and be a total mess. Depends on the intuitor, depends on their growth and their sensing, but it's a very important point to keep in mind, which is often, I think, is missed out. People talk about the weaknesses in sensing, they don't talk about the weaknesses in intuition. So yeah, that's what I would say about intuition versus sensing. If you really want to make good use of this, I'd actually combine it with introversion and extroversion. look for what the deficit is, not just a lack of intuition, but a lack of introverted intuition or a lack of extroverted intuition. That's when you're going to have a clearer signal for your typing, rather than something which can be proven wrong once you add a bit of growth into the mix. Okay, I hope that helped.